I know Monique from Windsor said that she had a chance to get out and have a little walk around the block, which is great. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our two presenters. They will be presenting Addressing Anti-Oppression and the ongoing partnership between COPA and OTF Safe at School resources. Mohini Athia is a secondary school teacher with the Toronto District School Board and very excited to join the community of Wandering Spirit School. She starts that position on Monday in special education and guidance. Mohini's long-standing commitment to social justice and anti-oppression is infused into all realms of her education practice. She has been a core team member at COPA for 12 plus years because of its unique, feminist, rights-based approach to fostering safe, strong, and free schools and communities. Some of her personal interests include traveling, running, and volunteering at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. Our second presenter, Janine Rohinda, is a programs facilitator and video content producer at COPA. She is also enjoying her second post-secondary endeavor, studying human rights and equity studies at York University. She finds great joy in facilitating the workshops COPA provides, particularly because of the positive impact they have on the younger generation by affirming their rights. She's a strong believer in creating space for all people groups to be heard, to learn, and to grow with one another in hopes of creating more conscientious and safe communities throughout Ontario. Janine's passion for social justice and human rights also informs her work as a multimedia visual artist with a focus on Black rights and social change. Please join me in welcoming Mohini and Janine to the workshop.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for being here. I don't know about all of you, but
Oh my God, I'm such a...
and spending time with Rania, and also this morning listening and learning with Jody and Nancy was so incredible. So again, thank you for being here. And Janine and I hope to share some specific tools. As we come in, if we can just mute ourselves, that would be great. Yeah, we're looking forward to sharing some additional thoughts, very specific tools. And one thing before I turn it over to Janine to say a few words is the strong theme, both from Rania, Nancy and Jody, is this theme of being on a continuous learning journey. And we'll be talking about that here too. So how do we find strength in ourselves and our vision and in our communities in what we are learning? And how do we continue to have humility and unlearn and learn together? Janine, is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to say hello and thank you everyone for being here. I think the topic for today, addressing anti-oppression, is one that is prevalent in our day-to-day lives. And so it's very exciting to see all you wonderful people come together and take on the initiative of becoming more anti-oppressive and on the journey towards becoming, you know, social justice, having a social justice stance in your daily life. Yeah, thank you.
So we'll just say a few words about COPA. COPA stands for Centre ontarien de prévention des agressions, or in English, the Ontario Centre for Violence Prevention. We are an award-winning provincial charity. We've been doing anti-oppression, child abuse prevention, and human rights work for more than 25 years. And one of the foundations of our work is this idea of children's rights and human rights being framed as everyone has the right to be safe, strong, and free. And so some of the work that we do is very school-based. In fact, a lot of our focus is on school-based assault prevention programs, right from junior kindergarten up until grade 12 for all parents and families, and also for all education staff. And all of our programming is developmentally appropriate and really centers on all of these themes of anti-oppression and rights-based learning, because if we don't know what our individual rights and our collective rights and responsibilities are, then that creates communities and spaces where violence can happen. Over 25 years, we've worked with more than 150,000 students and more than 20,000 adults, and maybe you've joined some of our training before. Janine.
Thank you. Yeah, so during our workshop today, our goal is to provide you with one outcome, or a takeaway to really equip you all in your journey of learning about anti-oppression. We would love for you to either choose from one of our lists here, or one for yourself even, whether that's one new insight, one new tool, one block of time to learn and explore together, and one commitment to addressing anti-oppression this month.
Yes, I mean, we're all here on a Saturday, so I mean,
already, yeah.
Commitment levels are pretty high, and yet this work is never ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and during this time together, we want to create a space where we're able to learn together. To do so, we have a few principles to help create a safe environment online for everyone to create space within yourself as well as we approach today's topic. So having an open heart and open mind as we approach these topics today, we want to encourage you to be open-hearted and open-minded to potentially new concepts and new terminology, new ideas. Being with discomfort really means that it's possible that some of these topics today could bring forth a sense of discomfort. If you do feel a sense of discomfort within yourself, we want to just encourage you to allow it to be. Learning to accept discomfort can be a sense that may propel you towards positive change. So rather than retreating into what may have felt comfortable in the past, we want you to take a moment, take a breath, recognize it within yourself, and recognize that you're on a journey of growth. For today's topics, we are going to be going broad and deep later. And really what that means is that while addressing anti-oppression, we're going to approach it from a broad sense to give a more of a holistic and wide understanding. And then we will be equipping you all with tools to be able to dive deeper within these topics in your own time, because learning is a journey and we all are on a learning journey. And it's important to remember that every person is at a different stage of their journey. So in our workshop today, we want to acknowledge this and take it into consideration during our dialogue. And also that we are in our journey of learning, we will be unlearning and relearning and learning together. As individuals, we have an array of experiences and knowledge to bring to the table. And we want to encourage an openness to unlearn and to address some things that we might have potentially been conditioned to believe from our society, or things that we have been taught even. And to take a stance to relearn new concepts and as we learn together as a community and a collective. To do so, we believe that having humility and self-compassion is very important as well. We want to encourage this while we talk about social injustices. Sometimes we will recognize that there might have been ways we ourselves might have contributed to them. But as we learn together, we want to promote self-compassion because we are on a journey and we are all growing, and sometimes growing means that there's growing pains, but we want to remember that we're all doing this work to bring about social justice for a greater cause. And we will learn together and remember humility as well. It is not a form of weakness, but rather it's an understanding that I may not understand right now, but I'm on my way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the words that were spoken before us at this conference are really kind of weaving through, and I'm sure they are for you, your entire journey here, plus at the conference. And we want to begin with just the context that we're in, which is, well, one of the contexts that we're in, which is a particular pandemic, and actually recognizing first, even before this COVID-19 pandemic, that oppression and all the forms of oppression are pandemics. and they have been pervasive and with us. Often they've been invisibilized. So just in this COVID-19 pandemic, we really want to address what many have spoken again before us at this conference around intersectionality and how this particular COVID-19 pandemic affects different people, different communities, differently, and the intersectionality within specific communities will disproportionately affect different people. So one way is sexism and misogyny, and we want to kind of just briefly touch on intersectional she session. So the disproportionate number of racialized women and migrant worker who are women who have lost jobs or face precarious employment during this time, intimate partner violence and child abuse, the rates as we are cloistered in close proximity to each other, how that's disproportionately affecting women and children, the kinds of anti-East Asian racism that's proliferated, which again is located in a context of anti-East Asian racism prior to the pandemic, classism and exploitation. So if we want to look at the pandemic, of course, with a capitalist lens, again, pre-existing conditions of labor and exploitation means that that gets exacerbated right now. And also this idea about individualism, this hyper individual ethic that we live with in the Western world and that we actually really have bought into gets super amplified, and actually the continued invisibilization of impact on communities. So for example, we get bogged down into mask wearing versus anti-masker conversations versus really truly looking at the disproportionate impact, illness and sickness in communities of color being continually ignored. So those are just some of the nuances and realities that we can continue to think about. So let's just, if some of you want to share, what have you heard and learned from students, families, colleagues about inequity and oppression at this time? We'll monitor the chat if you feel more comfortable. Otherwise, please unmute yourself and say a few words. That is most welcome. What have you seen and heard?
Hello, I'd like to share a little bit actually. So I work at an extremely rural school that's very homogenous in its construct in Prince Edward County. And so one thing that I've heard from students, families, colleagues, not obviously en masse, but whenever we attempt, which I'm a drama teacher, so addressing equity in the classroom and through materials is very important to me, and social justice is very important to me. And there's always questioning of why are we doing this or why are we replacing that? And I know, like as a father who has a child in secondary school now, like when I see the syllabus and I see the reinforcement of like dead white writers, very Western, very colonial framework, it just shows me how much work we have around inequity in the system across the province and beyond.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And I think, yeah, and Anne-Marie, I see your hand up. I think it was Matthew, it was you speaking. This constant getting bogged down into individual experiences versus that systemic. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, because we need to constantly pivot to talking about systemic and structural oppression. Anne-Marie, thank you. You're muted.
It's as if it's my first time on Zoom. You asked for examples of what we've learned from colleagues, and I wanted to go back to what I learned from you 2 minutes ago, framing oppression as a pandemic. And as a white educator, having never walked in the shoes of the oppression and the racism for me, that is such a significant way to frame it, because white people, we're living in this pandemic now. And so maybe it's this little way to help white people understand the oppression of Black people and Indigenous peoples. So that's a new learning, just another way to frame it. That's just a new learning for me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Amrita?
Oh, hey. So I have two. One is a question that I hear from, have heard from educators, is like, when will it ever be enough? It's kind of like, it includes the eye roll and the sigh. Like, when will it, like, at what point will we have put enough equity into place that we can be done? Which sometimes gets a little bit frustrating, right? It's uncomfortable. Like, oh, like you're just doing this as a chore? Okay, cool. Exactly, right? I just saw Matthew's comment. And then the second one is that I hear sometimes is from parents as well as from other staff members around, especially from other people of color, which is, oh, but like we suffered this, and this too. And then trying to be able to explain to parents, to other staff, to other adults, because I think children actually understand this concept better, but to other adults, that it isn't a hierarchy of, it's not an ouch competition, right? Like, again, sort of what Rania was saying yesterday about the hierarchy of freedom, like don't use the same metrics that you use for the hierarchy of power. So just those are two big ones that I encounter, and kind of, I'm always looking for support.
Yeah, thank you, Amrita. James?
Sorry, I don't have any comment. I was just agreeing with
sorry. Yes, it was a thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Janine, I don't know if there's anything in the chat, but yeah, there's a lot. Is there something in the chat, Janine?
Yeah, we're just kind of having dialogue about what was just mentioned, and Matthew just mentioned now. I've had the same conversation about the NBE Indigenous Literature class. People ask, why one voice?
I'm going to articulate on that because I hit send by accident. So what I want to say with that, why one voice over others? And my response always is, why are we only talking about now about including Indigenous voices? Why aren't we including voices across the curriculum at all times? I mean, that there should be, as we grow and develop, we won't need we should outgrow the need to even have specific courses, because we're doing it inherently, and accessing voices from across different intersectionality and different cultures and different ways of being and different perspectives is what I wanted to say, but I hit enter by accident.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to your comment there, and Amrita, one of your comments, and that is those of us, all of us who are doing anti-oppression and social justice work, constantly being put in that defensive position of having to explain and justify. And I think it was Rania who was just kind of talking about, or I've been thinking a lot about, how not to get caught up in that defensive position, rationalizing, justifying, right? Because those are red herrings and distractions. Those are distractions. And so how do we, again, individually and collectively not get caught up in that? And while understanding the reality of maybe having to address some of it, or how do we pivot conversations to not get sucked into that? That's something I'm constantly learning. So at COPA, we're always thinking, as you all are, about making positive change or disruptive change at the systemic and individual level.
Just to add, there was just one more comment that I think was wonderful from Joshua. I think about which societies and cultures we teach about when dealing with social studies curriculum and early societies. And well, that just kind of leads us into our next slide here, and it's about where do we begin or begin again. And when we're looking at issues of social injustice, I think it's very important to look at, the root and core of things. That way we can be informed about, where we're at currently. And so when we approach social, so how do we approach social change? That's really the question. And we're going to take time to look at the fact that, our society is built on colonization, capitalism, and enslavement. And those are the founding principles of our country. And really, when you think about that, then you can understand really the byproduct of these founding principles in our society that we currently live in is white supremacy. It's queer-phobic, patriarchal, capitalist societies. And oftentimes we aren't exposed to the day-to-day of what that might look like, or sometimes that information is withheld, even though we do live in the age of technology. We still see that marginalized groups are silenced, and that information is not brought to the forefront, or we weren't even exposed to it. So we wanted to just bring about some examples here. We have seen in recent times, in November, if I'm correct, an anti-Indigenous racism with the Micmac fishery. And what was going on there specifically is that the Micmac land back, the treaty between the Micmac communities was called the 1942 Land Back Lane, and it gave them access to specific areas where they had complete rights to fishing. And the settler colonialism from white groups in that community were attacking these people. And we can even see images of people destroying boats and livelihood. And we know that this is livelihood for these groups of people and communities. And that was just in November. Which the result of this has been that there is a new treaty that has been signed happily. And we can also see examples of anti-Black racism here in Toronto. Regis Kranzinski Pacquiao was a young individual who was at the age of 29 who died falling from 24 stories from High Park, which is actually just down the road from me. And the police were saying that Regis was on the balcony when they had arrived, and that she jumped. However, the family contested that their relative would not commit suicide, and that the police were responsible for her death. And so we can see that, the results of how our country was really founded still present themselves in our lives today. And oftentimes we can think that, like acts of racism are things of the past, or are things in the States, is something that I personally hear often when it comes to issues of inequity. But really it happens in our day-to-day and happens today. And I just wanted to bring our attention just to the little photo here on the right, just saying the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. And that individuals or communities are not deficient, and problems, and we're not problems to be fixed or blamed. Specifically communities that are marginalized, and specifically communities that are vulnerable, they are not the ones to blame, nor are they the ones to hold the entire responsibility of bringing forth change and social justice. So I see that Amrita's hand is up. You can go ahead.
I sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to sort of make a little connection to even what some of Rania was talking about yesterday, with regards to evidence, right? Like there's such a big push for like, oh, well, prove it, right? And to this point, like there is so much evidence, and this is no longer just like, oh, like they're just your like word of mouth, or this is your experience. Like we had the Ontario Ombudsman did the whole police review thing, and it overwhelmingly indicates that the police in Ontario disproportionately target people of color with a specific focus on Black and Indigenous folks. And like this is documented, it's documented by everybody, like by our justice system, and yet it's still, we have to provide so much more proof, almost like, oh, we still need to prove and qualify that these things are true, when in fact the whole purpose for all of these, the entire system was set up with the intention of controlling certain kinds of people. So we can chip around the edges of the status quo, but if we're not changing the heart of it, then I don't know, what are we doing? So just the connection I wanted to make there, especially with regards to the story of of Regis, and as well as like so many other stories that came out over the past year.
And something I heard, yeah, thank you, Amrita. And the other thing about this problematizing of individuals or whole communities of people, something I heard recently, there is a lot of videos and memes around, driving while Black or living while Black or shopping while Black. And someone said, no, it's policing while being racist. It's teaching while being racist. So don't locate the problem with people or entire communities. The problems are in the structures, and again around language and how profoundly language impacts our ability to see or conceptualize what's happening. Let's locate where the abuse of power really is. And I think Jody and Nancy really, I think it was Jody who really spoke about, don't see our communities, our nations as problems. We have, rich, complex civilizations that are thousands and thousands of years old, but we tend to get fixated on thinking of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues and peoples as problems to be fixed, and that's the dominant narrative. But we can upend that dominant narrative. So one resource we have, it's called Joining the Circle, and it was a joint project between COPA and the Ontario Teachers Federation, funded by the Ministry of Education, to strengthen our support as educators on disrupting anti-Indigenous racism and to further our professional development. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to our website, and we're going to watch a short video. So on our website, and maybe Janine, if you just put the URL in the chat, it's copahabitat.ca. I'm going to guide you through because there's so much on this website, you might have some difficulty finding it. So actually the first thing is when you come to this site, you will likely maybe see it in French. And so right on the top right-hand corner. And so for you all to know that all of our resources are in English and in French, and in fact, 8 different Indigenous languages, but I'll get there in a second. So click on the top right-hand corner on the EN if you would like to get to the English resources, which is where we're going to focus. Joining the Circle is under this left honeycomb called Toolkits. So I'm going to go there. There's actually 2 similarly named resources to support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit parents and families. That's a Circle of Caring. I'll talk about that later, but I'm going to go to Joining the Circle. So Joining the Circle, again, is a resource for us, largely as non-Indigenous educators. How do we disrupt anti-Indigenous racisms in our schooling and communities, whether we know we have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students or not. So I'm going to go to short animated films, and we have 10 short films. We're going to watch one now. We're going to watch the one that says reflecting our role on our role. So under video, you can see that it's in all of these additional languages as well. So let's watch the English one, and then we'll have a short conversation. They're about a minute long, and there's an accompanying guide, but we'll take a look at that after.
Sometimes when people think about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, stereotypes and negative images may come to mind. These ideas can stop people from seeing us as who we really are. Indigenous peoples are diverse, strong, and proud. Our cultures and traditions are rich, our histories are vast and complex, and our contributions to Canada are many. We can change our preconceived ideas by becoming aware of how Indigenous people see and interact with nature and the world, and our ways of knowing, being, teaching, and learning. Learning about new cultures can be intimidating, But don't be afraid to ask students, families, board staff, and community members, including elders. We share similar values, but we are not all the same. We are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and our many cultures and traditions are each beautiful and unique. Our heritage is very important to us, and we strive to make our children proud of their culture and of who they are. Learning about our cultures and making an effort to include our traditional ways of learning and being in the classroom makes the school a kinder and richer place where Indigenous children and their families feel welcome, safe, nurtured, and acknowledged.
So that is the film, and I just want to quickly show you the guide, and then if you want to share some thoughts, you can. So along with each of these short episodes, there is a discussion guide. And again, this is, while the films are animated, these are for us as adults. However, we know that adults are using these films with young people in really interesting, creative ways. So we don't we don't prevent you from doing that. Please use your creativity to do that. However, we develop these resources for us as adults in our own learning and unlearning. So just a little bit about what the narrated message was for this film, and then questions for group discussion. So one way that we encourage and help folks are using them is at a staff meeting, showing the 1-minute video and then having a large staff meeting, breaking off into groups and using some of these questions for group discussion. And then some ideas and strategies that we have included here. So again, each of these 10 films have a discussion guide with them. So I'll leave that up on the screen. Are there any immediate thoughts? Maybe we'll just take one in the—
Mohini, I'm sorry, it's Lindy. I just wanted to point out, because it's such an incredibly unique thing, is that each of the films is also available in a multitude of Indigenous languages. And what I have sometimes done is that it's kind of nice to listen to the languages, because you don't really get ever to hear them if you're not in an area where they're spoken. So I think it's also worthwhile working with students or with colleagues to just listen to the language, which is available through the different video tips that are there.
Yeah, thank you, Lindy, so much for pointing that out. And I think, again, yeah, depending on which treaty territory you might be on, to ensure that that language representation is there. And Lindy, on the subject of languages, I'm going to show the other tool, if I may. So I'm going to go back to toolkits, and I think someone else would like to share something. So let me just show this, and then please jump on in. Under guide and resources for joining the circle, again, in this effort to really prioritize Indigenous languages, in the middle here, Indigenous language tool, and in 7 different languages. So here we set the historical context of why reclamation, revitalization, and restoration of languages is so vital, and why communities themselves are strengthening their practice, and how we can support that. Just some common greetings in English, and then in, for example, in Cree, and then the phonetics. So if there's some way, I mean, hopefully if we have access to language teachers, that, as Jody and Nancy said, is the priority, that we have primary sources speaking these languages and teaching. But if we don't, you know, can we do this as you think is appropriate? Somebody want to share? Please go ahead. No? Okay. Any thoughts? Janine, I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I can't see everything.
No, that's okay. James just mentioned thanks for those excellent resources with video capturing important topic areas. The one we just watched is narrated by an Indigenous person, which is authentic and powerful. I also just I think maybe 2 days ago, I came across another resource that I think would be wonderful as well. It's a way to discover which Indigenous territory you are currently located on based off of your zip code. And I just found the phone number, and I thought I'd just also share that as well, because you can just text your postal code or zip code or town or city and discover it. And you know, that could also be a wonderful little activity that maybe you guys could implement or discover on your own time as well. So I just put that in the chat as well for usage. So yeah.
A final thought about joining the circle and also a circle of caring. I don't know if we'll have time, but a circle of caring is distinct in that there is not a lot of support. Often parents and families don't feel very supported in kind of navigating through education systems, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit families, because of that history of colonization in residential schools, it's so deep and it's so vast that those barriers. And so a circle of caring is resources specifically created with and by Indigenous peoples. So we had a First Nations Advisory Council, a Métis Advisory Council, and an Inuit Advisory Council. And we spent 3 years again, consulting, collaborating to create that resource. So that's specifically to support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit families. So check that out. Okay, Janine.
Oh, hello. Yes, thank you. Now we're going to just head into what anti-Black racism kind of looks like and frame it a bit more. And the word intersectional is quite important when we're talking about any type of form of discrimination, because the word intersectionality, which was actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, it's to describe how race, class, gender, and really any other characteristic intersect and overlap with one another to create a specific type of complexities when it comes to what people face in terms of prejudice or their daily experiences. And so when we look at the word intersectional, you know, and we think of anti-Black racism, we're not just simply thinking of Black people, right? We're thinking of, okay, what is their socioeconomic status currently, or, you know, how do they identify? Because we know that people who have specific identity markers such as, you know, Black doesn't just mean that they're just Black. They may be a woman or a trans woman, and that will also create a different set of challenges or experiences of oppression. And so, yeah, we just want to always keep in mind the intersectionalities that come into play with every form of discrimination, and specifically anti-Black racism, because oftentimes we can see how there may be invisibility to people's specific types of experiences. And we want to remember, you know, it's not only in the US, even though it's oftentimes propagated in our media that racism, anti-Black racism is happening in the US. Enslavement was in Canada as well, you know, and it's a continued legacy, notably in education, when we see Black students disproportionately suspended or expelled, or even the vigilance that happens with Black students, and constantly the assumptions that, you know, that they might be up to no good or things of the sort. And, you know, anti-Black racism presents itself on a daily basis for Black people. And when we think of things such as microaggressions, the reason why we place the word macro right in front of microaggressions is because microaggressions is defined as indirect or subtle or unintentional discrimination against Black people, specifically in this context. But when we really think about microaggressions, really the effects of microaggressions are macro. They are continual, you know, they're little things that are said, you know, in the cafeteria or to a colleague, or, you know, things that might even sound as though they are compliments, such as, you know, one that I personally receive quite often is, oh, you know, you're so beautiful for a Black girl, or, you know, you look so, like cultural, you know, and things like that. Actually, you know, is, for me personally, that is discrimination and an attack on me personally, because that's insinuating, you know, that there's a specific way of looking or being that I do not comply to, which is an Eurocentric standard of beauty. And you know, this happens on the daily, and it is traumatizing. And specifically in the context of the institution of education that we're looking at today, having to prove racism in these institutions to individuals or you know, the system itself can be exhausting. And how we mentioned earlier that, you know, it's not the sole responsibility for marginalized groups or the people who are being oppressed to do so, but it often falls on their shoulders. And we just also wanted to mention that, you know, there's complete erasure and or appropriation of Black resistance, strength, and resilience. You know, when what are we teaching in our system? Because they're quite rooted, like how we mentioned earlier, you know, they are rooted in Eurocentric curriculums, and there's a specific rhetoric and voice that we are hearing. And you know, personally, I can speak on the fact that I really did not have any education of what Canada's history in terms of, you know, Black rights and what that looked like in the history.
Where the fuck do I get the course?
Say that again, sorry. Sorry, did somebody speak? Okay. And yeah, so, you know, the lack of exposure to historical events that are very prevalent in our society, such as Africville, for example, in Nova Scotia, that wasn't something I was exposed to until later on in life. So yeah, so just recognizing all these things, and we can jump to the next slide, Mohini. Or if there's any questions or comments. Oh, I actually see Rita had said, and racism from other parents at the school. There are people who openly point the finger at Black students in the school when they want to, when they want to absolve their own child. Absolutely, yeah. Profile, you know, that looks like profiling children, essentially. And we wanted to, did you want to say anything?
Well, just then how important it is for us as educators to be able to respond to that, especially when they could be like powerful parents, right? People who are on parent councils or people who in society hold a lot of power, because it has happened, and we'll just be like, oh, it wasn't my kid, it was that big Black kid. Like literally those were the words that they said.
Yes, yeah.
Right, so, but for us, like this training is also to help us deal with those situations, right?
Absolutely, yes. And so kind of just on that note, we oftentimes see how in society, we have a graphic actually created by the Conscious Kid. We can see how there are things in our society that are racist, but they're socially acceptable. And then we see things that are socially unacceptable. So, you know, most of us can agree, you know, that things like the KKK, using the N-word, racist jokes are things that are not acceptable. But when it comes to things like, you know, racially profiling, what we just mentioned, or tokenism, or white savior complex, or Eurocentric curriculum, those are all things that are socially acceptable still in our society. And as we can see in this specific photo, we can see the disproportionate amount of acts of racism that are actually acceptable in our society. We did want to highlight a few here. So the one that's just at the top here is that's circled that says white silence. Oftentimes just how we were discussing as well, we can see that people take a stance, specifically white people take a stance of silence rather than actually addressing the issue. And what that creates is compliance, really, and not only perpetuates the issue if we're not speaking on it, if we're not, addressing it at the time of, if we see something that is racist, if we're not addressing it at the time, then really we're contributing to it in a sense. So not believing the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color, that's what the acronym BIPOC stands for. Not believing the experiences of those groups of people is also another way to silence those groups of people and their experience. Prioritizing white voices as experts. Oftentimes when we're looking at, who are the experts in the room, who have the most power in the room, who are we going to for advice or things like that, oftentimes we can see that it's people who are white voices. And when it comes to this specific issue, there needs to be constant communication across different groups of people, because different groups of people experience it differently. And specifically with anti-Black racism, the voices that need to be uplifted are those of Black people. Not challenging racist jokes, that's one that we can see often. And that's something, that is definitely socially acceptable. And little things like "you're so articulate," or what I had mentioned before, like, "oh, you're so beautiful for a Black girl," things like that. Is there anything that you all see in this little graphic that stand out to you, or that you've even witnessed?
James, you had your hand up earlier.
Oh,
I don't know if you wanted
Oh,
to.
thank you.
yes,
Thank you.
sorry, I missed that.
I'll make a quick comment here. I'll go back to what one of you, Heather Mohini or Janine, said earlier about intersectionality. I'm a teacher, and I believe that students' behaviors are purposeful. So a student, when they behave a certain way, there could be a reason behind that. So those reasons may be too many. Maybe it's poverty, and the child does not know how to say, "I'm poor, I'm hungry, I need help." So the only way they know is to draw attention to themselves by behaving in a certain way. But then we also realize that from the image currently you've put on there, sometimes it's easy to blame racialized and indigenous kids for something. Either maybe they are more likely to be poor or to come from dysfunctional family. Something is wrong, something is missing with them. And we tend to shift our conversation from the societal factors, whether it is in the school or in the society, that may be affecting these kids. So there could be something racist in the school, and that's how they are rebelling. So we don't want to focus on those society things. Instead, look at the individual, because it's easy to blame the individual. It's easy to address a complex issue in a simple way, especially if you can point it on to an individual.
Yes, absolutely. And Matthew, go ahead.
Well, I didn't really want to follow James there because that was awesome. But this is this isn't the exact same type of scenario, but it's similar. And so as I said before, I work in a very rural, I want to put my hand down and then up again. Very rural school, predominantly white. But we do, I mean, the thing that I feel is that because of that, we owe more to the work that needs to be done to ensure for equitable, safe spaces. And we had one year like a massive ice storm right before an end of December concert, which we renamed only recently from the Christmas concert to the holiday concert, because and then we were all going to say something as a staff because no students were there that day, and someone said, "What should we say?" And someone said, "Oh, Merry Christmas, of course." And I said, "We should say." I said, "I feel we should say Happy Holidays because that doesn't encompass all of our students." And they said, and I quote, "Welcome to Canada." And I was like, and I said, "You know what? So what are you saying? We should go back to because I mean, it's not a Christian. That's a Christian notion of holidays, and we need to be more in the public space. We have to be inclusive of everyone, or else we're excluding people." And the very next year, I saw two of our new students from Syria playing Santa Claus in a Christmas play that they're for, because we're a K-12 school, that their teacher put together. And I was saying we're not honoring the different students we have in front of us. We're excluding those voices, and that's reinforcing that system.
Yes, go ahead, Mohini.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you for sharing that, Matthew. I think, again, another form of resistance to actually listening to people and to listening to other perspectives in an attempt to further re-entrench dominant power. And that is a very specific tactic used to, again, disorganize us, to take our attention and fighting and justifying, or just it's their distraction tactics. One thing I'll say about this white supremacy iceberg is that I find it's missing a lot of intersectionality, and specifically naming how Black, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and a variety of racialized, for example, women will experience racism. So I started to do a gender supremacy iceberg, kind of modeled on this, but very intersectional, because I haven't seen that around different forms of oppression. So we can continually interrogate and look for what's missing, because again, we're all learning and expanding. Janine, anything else before we move on?
Yeah, we just had a comment from Jen on the point that James had made, saying we often two times move to fix the child instead of fixing the system. And absolutely, because in essence, you know, fixing the child is, as James was alluding to, you know, easier, so much easier just to, you know, specifically pull out one person and blame that person for something that they are conditioned into, you know, the society that they're conditioned into, which is so much larger, you know, it's such a greater scale of an issue. And so thank you so much for as well bringing that point. And yeah, we can jump to the next slide. Thank you.
And I think one thing that doesn't get named here is all the internalized oppression that we as either women, trans people, folks of color, people with a variety of abilities, we internalize the dominant narratives, and that is also an expression of white supremacy. So we want to get to some resources on safeatschool.ca. This is again another 13-year partnership with the Ontario Teachers Federation. So I'm going to take you to the website again, but on this slide, you can see the wide variety of resources we have on Safe at School. We have at least 2 documentary films, one specifically talking about anti-oppression, the other one around bullying prevention and intervention. We have a series of posters, buttons, and guides. And I think you were all, if you registered in time, you were sent a guide, and it looks like this. So we're going to focus on, yeah, I see yours, James, only because I see only 6 of you at a time, but thank you, James. So this is our guide, and so I'm going to take you to the website, but basically the content on the website is on this guide, so we'll kind of switch back and forth. So one of the big challenges sometimes is naming and accountability. And again, we've talked about this at this conference. Folks, we all at various points have difficulty naming inequity, like sexism, misogyny, racism, homophobia. And I want to say in one of our earliest slides, Janine and I talked about it, and we called it, we are now using the term queerphobic. And we want to specifically name 2 various aspects of queerphobia. One is around sexual orientation, so who we are attracted to, and the prioritizing of heteronormativity. And the other is around transphobia and queering identity and queering gender identity. So because often when we talk about homophobia, it has been historically marginalizes and invisibilizes women who are lesbian, or invisibilizes people who have a different orientation, maybe pansexual, maybe asexual, and the entire constellation of how we may express ourselves sexually. Classism, so we just talked about, locating the problem in individual people as if communities are responsible for their own impoverishment. So again, in naming some of these out loud, it can bring up shame, blame, defensiveness, discomfort, and guilt. And so we'll look on the Safe at School site where we can kind of start to shake those up. Ownership and accountability. Again, I think in the caring professions, especially teaching, I have had a relationship to myself as a teacher as I must know everything. I must be perfect. I must know everything. I must save everyone. I must always have the answers. And if you haven't checked out dismantlingracism.org and their document on white supremacy and all the ways that white supremacy manifests in things like perfectionism and white savior complex, I really recommend you check that out. But those are some of the barriers why we sometimes cannot or have difficulty being transparent. And I really liked how yesterday Rania just did that in using the term guys all the time. And Janine and I talked about that recently as well. Again, we've internalized these things. Can we, in a transparent way, in the moment say, whoops, whoa, wow, I just said that. I've been saying that for a long time. That's not really what I want to say. Okay, let me back up here. And when we do that with our colleagues and families and the children and youth we are with, we are modeling healthy use of our power to say we are also learning. And that's really quite critical. So actually, because we've got about 10, 13 minutes left. I'm looking at my clock, and we're going to be yanked right off the stage. I want to take you to the Safe at School website right now. So you can find where some of our resources are. Okay, so here is the Safe at School resource website. And again, it's in French and English. You'll see on the top right-hand corner. I'm going to go to professional learning and, whoops, one second. Gotta hide that toolbar. If you go into professional learning, we're gonna go right to equity and inclusive education. And in fact, even at COPA, I mean, we set up this website probably about 12, 13 years ago. We have discovered at COPA, there are lots of things that need changing and revision here as we have learned over these years. So even equity and inclusive education, we are saying anti-oppression. Because equity into what? I really loved that Nancy named that. First Nations people are not equity-seeking groups. They have had treaties prior to colonizers coming here. They have treaties. They have not ceded any. They're not equity-seeking groups. So you know, we're talking about anti-oppression practices. So for example, I think I want to like even this term becoming an ally and how fraught that language is. We are using at COPA language such as disruptor, advocate, which, and again, we don't want to get into semantics just about language. It's really about action. It's really about learning, unlearning, and getting into the action piece. So there's a whole lot here. If you drill down all of these core concepts, which allow us to, again, learn, unlearn, and move into action. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint slide because there's actually, so one of the key areas is understanding our own power and privilege and taking responsibility for that. And then we've already alluded to some of the traps in doing anti-oppression work, some of the traps that other people will lead us into, and some of the traps that maybe we get ourselves into. So in terms of examining power and privilege, there's this whole section on understanding sexism, racism, and homophobia. Again, we would relook at our language, but intersections, power and privilege, you can kind of take a look through there. The myth of normality, intersectionality, and multiple identities. And I think related to that, if you go to reflection exercises and examples, one very practical tool is we've listed a whole bunch of questions here. So perhaps you would use that with staff members. Perhaps you will engage with them yourself. Perhaps you will edit and amend and use these with students, so that they can reflect on themselves and their larger context in which they study and be. So how are we kind of shaking up all of these ideas all the time? So there's a lot there. And again, I'll say that, you know, some of our language has changed as well. So while we look at binary gender identity, we also hear down at the bottom in terms of looking at gender and gender identity, but there can be more developed here. There can be more nuance around specific forms of racism. So there's a lot. We're all learning and unlearning as we go. Okay, I'm gonna speed through. we got into such rich conversations, and thank you for contributing to that. That means we don't have time to kind of have you all take a look at the site right now. So Janine, stop me. Is this my part or your part? Why don't you go for it?
You know, I believe this is me. Yes. And so when we're talking about accountability specifically, we want to talk about how we can use our privilege. While we've been speaking about intersectionality, while we experience different challenges with our intersectionality, we also have different privileges. And so meaning, for example, if I take myself, for example, though I am a Black person that identifies as a cisgender heterosexual woman, I am an able-bodied person, which means that I do have privileges in the society in terms of, you know, my access to being able to go upstairs in my apartment. My apartment doesn't have an elevator, for example. And so that, taking that into consideration, you know, take the time to observe within yourself what privileges you potentially may have, and how you can contribute to sharing that privilege and using your privilege in a positive way to impact your society, your classrooms, and things like that. So here we wanted to talk about, again, yes, unlearning, relearning, and learning. And we are privileged and disadvantaged systemically and individually, and how that comes into play into the places we occupy as well. And Mohini actually mentioned about being an accomplice, an advocate, a disruptor, a change leader, and what that looks like in your contexts of your classrooms. We just have a little comment here saying, I like to use privilege until it doesn't exist anymore. I like to say use privilege until it doesn't exist anymore. Sorry, thank you, Matthew, yes. And Anne-Marie said, if someone described me as a disruptor, I would take that as a very positive feedback. Absolutely, because taking the time to disrupt any type of social injustice takes time, it takes energy. And I think it is definitely a very positive term to use. Yeah, and using our power and privilege for oppressive work, approaching all the isms, you know, and really ensuring that we are taking the time to disrupt it. Yeah, I feel like you actually kind of covered quite a bit, Mohini, when you were just going over things. But just this last point here, marginalized people have been consistently promised, but persistently denied. And this is a very important point as well, just because when we're looking at how to create positive change in our society, you know, marginalized people are constantly promised things such as, like, you know, oh yes, we support you and we uplift you, but then that's not actually, you know, played out in their community or in their society, or, you know, things are taken away. And so we want to just take the time to remember that we do all have a responsibility within ourselves as well to how we're contributing to our communities and how we're contributing to the spaces that we occupy. Yeah, and Mohini, anything else on that? Okay.
No.
No, okay, go ahead.
That. I think we already showed where these questions were in the reflection exercises. And again, I think what we want to do is redress balances of power. And I think, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead. We took a look at some of these principles in terms of doing our anti-oppression work. And one thing, as I'll kind of draw your attention to the guide, if you have it, is at COPA, we really believe in prevention. How do we create communities that prevents violence, that prevents oppression? However, we know we live in societies where, my gosh, violence and oppression of all kinds are happening. So how do we have responsive strategies instead of reacting? Because often, we will go into fight, flight, freeze, and there's a fourth one called fawning. We will go into those reactions because evolution, we've evolved that way. However, if we are grounded in other principles, maybe we're going to be able to respond. So if you look in your guide and on page 66, there's a whole section on the prevention. And again, you've all been doing this work. Both like, what do our schools look like, sound like, and feel like in order to prevent oppression? However, we also know that we're going to have to interrupt oppression. And so that there's some strategies on page 76 and onwards. So we recognize both realities. We can proactively create safe, inclusive, beautiful, welcoming communities. And we know that we don't live there yet, as we are attempting together to create that. So what do we do when we do meet those situations? How do we meet those situations in the biggest, most whole ways that we can? So take a look at the guide there, and that's also on the website. The last thing, and Janine is gonna address it, is a unique form of oppression called adultism that Nancy and Jody alluded to.
Yes, yeah. So adultism, we thought would be a wonderful topic to share on, especially just, in our classrooms and our educational environments. Adultism essentially is a discrimination against young people, specifically children and youth. And if we can just jump to the next slide. Thank you, Mohini. Yeah, so adultism is the belief that adults are superior to children and youth, and that there is definitely an intersectional aspect when it comes to, what the youth's gender may be, or their race and different things as such. But we also wanted to clarify what the difference may be between adultism and ageism. Ageism is any form of discrimination that has to do with age. And so specifically things like youthfulness obsession, discrimination in multiple directions essentially is what ageism is. For example, maligning millennials or elderly people as a burden. And so we've seen this across, different spaces, but specifically going back to adultism, not believing that the youth or the children of our day have knowledge and deep understanding of social issues is something that I see quite consistently, now, especially with the technological age, I see youth having deep understandings of what, for example, what anti-Black racism is. They have exposure to it from multiple sites and social medias, and they have exposure to what things look like. And then there is this sense of independence in the learning of youth these days that I see that I don't think even my generation really had, because of the social media era, that they have access to all information and that they can really make decisions and be critical. And we can see throughout history that it is young people who lead the biggest marches and change and bring things forward. We've seen it throughout history that these young people that are the leaders in this. And so when it comes to adultism and specifically social injustices, it's very important not to underestimate and to also give voice and give youth and children even space to be able to learn and also to be able to speak on these topics too. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I think Rania mentioned yesterday Arundhati Roy, who, and I'm going to paraphrase, it's not that people don't have a voice, it's that people aren't listened to. So children and youth have had wisdom since the beginning of time. It's that we don't center their experiences. So how do we as educators dismantle that? On the COPA Habitat site, there are a series of storybooks and a comic that you can use in addressing some of these topics that we have, specifically empathy, kindness, and disrupting bullying. So check that out. And we're just going to leave our websites and social media details up on the screen. And yeah, please get in touch with us at infocopa.com. We do workshops right now online, but also in person, hopefully in the future. So please contact us if you're interested in having us work with you, or please reuse the resources, please share them far and wide. And thank you deeply. We are honored to do this work with you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Mohini and Janine, thank you so much for helping us on this continuous journey and giving us a safe space to do that. Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge and understandings and the multitude of resources that are available to us as teachers. I know I visit this website often. It has helped me to grow in my practices and understanding. Mohini, good luck next week. I can't believe that you're so calm right now that on Monday you start that new position, and how lucky they are to have you at Wandering Spirit School. I sincerely wish you the best, but mostly I want to say how lucky those students are to have you. So thank you very much to both of you. And actually just a little plug that COPA will be delivering a workshop at our Beginning Teachers Conference at the end of the month. So I thank you for that as well. The link for our next session is in the chat. So if you want to go back to the big room, there it is that Jeffrey has posted that for us. Thank you, Jeffrey. And we'll go back for our final keynote speakers and then later to wrap up the day. So thank you again to both of you. And thank you to all of you for being here at the presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much for all the rich conversation, and have a wonderful rest of your conference as well.